I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So today we're talking about naming in tabletop RPGs. Naming can be hard. It can be very hard. If you get the wrong name, it can just completely throw off what you're doing, especially if you're improvising and you just name something and then it turns out to be a name that you didn't like. Or worse, you're publishing in a publication, you're writing like a Land of the Linarm King's book, and you decide to name a nymph guardian of a pool like Imavajina, thinking it's like, I don't know what you're thinking it's like, but this is a real thing that happened in a tabletop RPG book for Paizo. And then you can tell how people would have pronounced that when they started giggling at it, even if it was supposed to be like Imavajina or something like that.
Yeah.
So if you have a bad name like that, or a name that maybe isn't bad but has serious problems, you can cause big issues. If you have the right name, it just can make things click. It's like the power of true naming in Magic in RPGs. It just makes sense and it just works better. Like, for example, I feel like Arcane Mark is a good name for this channel because it condenses a lot of different things down together into the channel. Like, it's perhaps not as good of a name as it was when I was the only one on the channel.
Yeah, and that's something that folks have commented on somehow, is sometimes it's like, why does it have your name in it but not mine? And that's because it was like originally your concept and I joined starting on like episode 10 or whatever.
But people have also said that they thought it was a really good choice of a name because like the word arcane, in addition to meaning magic, has other meanings and there's like a variety of things. So it can be very hard to get the right name. Sometimes you can wind up creating like this complex situation for your RPG that took you like an hour or two to make, and then it takes you more than an hour or two to pick the name that you need for it. Because you're like, oh no, but that name has this thing. I googled that name and it was on Urban Dictionary. Ooh, but that version of that name is actually a term from this from a language spoken by 500 people.
Actual experience that I had, because part of developing stuff for me is Googling names, and like there was a name that was like, oh, that seems like a cool name, and then I Googled it and the first hit was like Urban Dictionary. This is a slang for a particular sexual act, and it's like, okay, I'm not gonna go with this name. I'm gonna change this name.
Or when you pick a name that sounds very like random fantasy constructy thing, like Zergorex, and then it's like, oh no, this is a medication.
Zergorex is a medication for diabetes or whatever. Yes. And you're like, well, I don't want that to
Let's see if Zergorex
this is particularly a problem with names for like dragons and other things like that. They use like their Z's and X's.
No,
it's
Zyrtec
not. It's just
is
close
the
to
only
Zyrtec.
Close medication.
Yeah, because medications for some reason you will use their Z's and X's. Sometimes you'll also wind up with names that you come up with, and it's like, oh, this is a name of a major city in a different country.
I think because the same reason that people think Zergorex might sound like a ferocious, majestic dragon. They think it sounds like
a medication that's going to solve your problems.
Complicated medication that's very high tech and successful or something.
There's an example of a certain DM on Crit Role naming a hero Pervon, much to the lesser version for the full cast. But I think what this gets to is that it's very easy to like have a name that you initially select and then has like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have picked that. So one of the things that one of the tips that this points to is when you pick a name, say it out loud. Try
correct.
like saying it out loud in a few different ways and see if it could be like an issue.
That's right. So if you have an NPC and you're like, well, let's write it down. Pervon for the first name, and the last name is Minao. That seems fine. And then you read it out loud, and it's like, okay, so the NPC's name is Pervon Me Now. Maybe not.
Like it's a
maybe
problem.
not.
Yes.
Maybe don't. Maybe we're not gonna do that NPC name.
Yes. So that's definitely a consideration with names, is like, is the name going to come across as like meaning something else that is distracting or funny or inappropriate or whatever it is going to, yes, that's a great, think of what nicknames kids in school would have derived from it. That's a great idea, Scott. It's just like, how would people have figured this out? And this is particularly important for like recurring NPCs and locations and things like that, where you're gonna be like seeing them a lot. Like if you accidentally call like a one-off NPC who shows up in one scene something that's kind of funny, like maybe you'll lower the gravity of that one scene, but like they're not, they're not gonna be someone who like is coming around with the party all the time, unless you give someone a humorous name and then the party decides that's like their favorite NPC. And they want to see them again, and then that could.
You could also have a player character who just gives humorous nicknames to everybody.
Yeah.
Like my bard, Edward from Kingmaker, was constantly giving nicknames to other PCs that stuck, such as Sabathiel Lolandir, the Elven Magister. My bard called Lollipop. And even the player started calling his wizard Lollipop. And we called his Mages Guild the Lollipop Guild.
Yes.
And just like everybody called him Lollipop. So that is
something
something
where
that
like
happen.
characters in world. Once he just started calling his character. Once he just started calling his character Lollipop out of character and things like that, we're just like, all right, we're gonna put on the Lollipop Guild song and like have like sort of in-world events where people's like, who is Sabathiel Lolandir? Oh, it's Lollipop, the Archmage. I see.
Mm-hmm. And we also had a wiki page where it was just a picture of a lollipop was the like character picture for him. But that's when you have to, commit to it. But sometimes in the wrong campaign, like if it was like a gritty horror campaign that was very serious, then actually sometimes it's the right thing to do to light the mood at certain points in time. It can actually accentuate the horror. But other times it might not if you have a character that is being called Lollipop.
Rohit talks about like one problem with that is sometimes actual names in real languages might seem inappropriate in English. And doesn't know whether the right approach is to adhere to English sensibilities. When I'm looking at publication, I'll try to check things in both directions, right? So if something would seem, if something is like, oh, this seems fine in English, but like is like an offensive word in another language, I would say, let's not choose that because you're.
But he's talking about the other one. Hard Dick is a real name in India, but if you name someone Hard Dick, then there's things they're gonna do in English. Another example, even from Spanish, Jorge is one that
it's a common name.
It's just George.
Yeah.
Right, but people have a certain way that they.
Yeah, no,
I
know. For example, when I was taking Spanish in school, and the teacher said, everybody pick a Spanish name. It was the class clown who decided that would be their name, and yeah.
Yeah, it's always the class clown in every Spanish class chooses Jorge as their name. I think, unless there's someone who's actually named George who's serious who picks it sooner than that, and then I'm sure that they use it as part of their routine. But I would say think about where you're going to publish it, and try to think about also if it's supposed to be a character that's like based. So like if you had someone who was based on being like from an India style fantasy, then you want to and you're publishing it mainly in English speaking countries, like in English, I would try to make sure that it doesn't cause you a problem in either English or in the related languages that the fantasy derives from, in either one. That's what I would suggest. And similarly, but you don't have to worry about like if it's weird in French at that point. Whereas if you publish it in French, then don't worry about English. And yes, it might eventually be translated, but I think also people will definitely cut some slack if they know they're reading the French translation of a thing that was written in English about fantasy India, and it happens to be a pun in French.
Yeah. Or then the translators can try to say, okay, maybe we don't want to go with that pun because we don't want it to be a problem in sort of the translation language or the source, or either the related source languages.
Right. Absolutely.
I think also like this is like when we were talking for publication here. I think like if you're doing it for your home group, I think that you can totally be like, yeah, let's take this name. It's a real legitimate name, and then if you know your players and are they going to like make a problem out of it, or is this going to create like an uncomfortable situation at the table where people are going to be like trending close to being racist in the way they're responding to it, or is this something that can sort of be resolved by like, are you saying that in character? Are you making fun of this person's name? Because like that's gonna have consequences.
Only the social contract and maturity level of your table, and you kind of need to gauge it if it's a table of new people that you haven't met yet. You're not even going to be able to guess where their comfort level is at based on any cues other than having a frank conversation and talking to them about it. Like you could try to guess based on like other things that new people that you haven't gamed with before have told you about what they like, but you might find out that you're wrong about that. It's easier to just talk it out. And Scott says to run it by the pun person, and then they will solve find all of your hidden puns that you might not have thought of with the name. I mean, that can work too, for sure. Now, when we're talking about names that have wordplay or other associations with them, there are ones that like would immediately take you out because it's like the nymph queen that I suggested before, or we talked about Pervon, Me Now, or something like that. But there's also can be names that are
there's
names that can be allusions to fiction, history, or mythology. For example, in Pathfinder, there are many such allusions that were created before Paizo got like a hard line on not putting in illusions, and then a decent number that were created after that anyway. But like Lycia Nasa, the goddess of water, who's the holy goddess of water, is named for a Greek sea nymph, or Gosra, the god of the waves and the sky, is Werner Herzog's last name spelled backwards.
Yes.
Or like Kalian was named for like I think it was like Sutter's relative's kid, or there's a whole bunch of names in Golarion and in many other settings that are allusions, and allusions are cool. Like a lot of people make allusions to mythology when they're creating fantasy things. Like if you play computer games or video games, you'll find that you'll just like, oh yeah, this attack is just called Ragnarok.
Yeah.
And there are Ragnarok attacks in like 5 different video game franchises at least, and I'm underestimating. And
oh yeah, for sure.
That's not counting the ones that are based on actual Norse Ragnarok, just ones where it's just like Ragnarok is just in there. And so using names from mythology can be a cool way to tie things in. For example, in Eldamon, all of the ultimate abilities that you get at level 19 that you can only use once per hour are mythological names for things that are elemental. Although force was actually really hard because there's not that many things that do elemental force.
Yeah, and I think that coming with this too is like, if you're publishing with like a specific company, like Paizo has like more of a like anti-illusion stance than I think I've seen in any other like media in terms of like how they consider things. Which I think in part
nobody has a stance like that.
Which in part I think comes from like the concern that someone's gonna put in like, you know, a reference to a modern video game or something that will come across as jarring. It's like, oh yeah, this is, and take people out of it.
But it's happened, right? In Mummy's Mask, there was a trap that had floor tiles whirl up from the floor one at a time at you, and you had to block them with your shield, and it said it was a trap that came from another legend or something like that. And everyone who saw it thought it was cool.
Yeah, but I think, you know, folks have a different thing. So if you're just like running it for your home group or something for your home group, I would say like, yeah, absolutely. There's no harm in doing the illusions unless you think it's something that's going to detract from the tone of what you're trying to do.
Which usually it won't.
Which
but
usually
it depends
it won't.
on what it's an allusion to, right? If it's an
Yeah.
allusion to something that
has a
is-
very different tone from what you're going for.
or that is like very political and you want to play a less political game or something like that, then it can cause you some issues potentially. But like great literature from throughout time have had allusions to other legends, myths, literature, and things like that.
And Rohit says, like, yeah, you need to be considerate about, like, the
Yes.
original reference.
Rohit is absolutely right. You can't just throw in an allusion to something and use it completely wrong.
Mhm.
If you do, you're gonna cause some issues. That's something that a lot of times you'll hear from sensitivity consultants, and Rohit's example of Shiva in Final Fantasy is a great example. It's
Yeah.
perfect because it's like it's this woman who's cold, like shivering, but that's not even remotely so much what
Yeah.
Shiva is. So if you want to use a reference, and it's not just a name that where it's just like, oh, this is just a powerful spell called Ragnarok, but especially if it's named after a character's name, it should have something that like is connected to the actual myth of the character. So if Shiva was like a destruction spell because Shiva is a deity of destruction, or even a like a destructive male summon that more resembled what you would expect, then it might not be as weird as this woman who snaps her fingers and creates glaciers or something like that. Similarly, and worse, is when you take something that's the name of a deity in a practiced religion and make it is not like considered a bad or evil deity or one of the bad guys, and make it just like a random demon or something.
Yeah, that's a serious problem.
That could be an issue. That can be a significant issue, especially if it's a major deity and you're like, oh, this is a level 4 demon that's named that. Like, imagine if there was an RPG that was published in some other country. You know, China decided, okay, we're gonna make an RPG, or Japan or India, and then they decided to like name like a level 4. It was in Japan, and there was like a level 4
monster
Oni.
named Jesus.
Yeah, a level 4 Oni named Jesus.
Yeah.
And it like had a beard kind of like Jesus, and it attacked
and then
you.
with like
attacked you
crosses
by
or something.
or no, it attacked. Yeah, it had a cross weapon. I guess this is even maybe more close to him than you would think, but it's still a problem. It had a cross weapon that would hit you, and on a critical hit, it turns some of your blood into wine and poisons you. And like this could probably be something that some people would be a little bit be like, why is it a level 4 Oni demon with a beard that hits you with a cross that does that? Like, if you think about it in that perspective, that's the same thing as if you make a like a weak opponent that is named after a deity from any other religion. So keep that in mind. For example, when I use names of like deities or powerful things in Alderman, they are the ultimate ability. And they do something that is similar to what you would expect from that ability. And you have to respect the source material. So, for example, I have an ability called Vajra, which is named after, the aspect of Vajra. It is a powerful, it's usually depicted as a mace, but it's like a lightning attack from Hinduism. And it's irresistible. Nobody can stop it from dealing damage. So I made it so that is a ultimate ability, and even on a critical success, you still take a little bit of damage from it because it's like, no, it's irresistible. It's Vajra. That's what it does. It's a lightning attack. I didn't make it like a cold attack or something that like a second level cold or ability or something like that, because that wouldn't fit. So this is a little bit about naming. I want to go back to also a question that Scott asked about, what about common names? That can be a problem, and it's one that nobody is immune to. For example, Shizuru is a deity in Golarion. It's basically just like if you had it could be like naming a deity like Mary.
Yeah.
It was like, some of those Tian Sha deity names are like that, where it's just like, yeah, it's just like a basic name of a person. that deity has. You may want to think about what you're doing if you do that. If you wouldn't be willing to name your goddess Mary, or you might be like, well, the Virgin Mary. So
okay, let's pick
Jane.
Yeah.
Jane, and Rohit says, or Mark as a deity. Apparently, there is someone who made like a post-apocalyptic fantasy world where like the designers of Pathfinder 2nd Edition were worshipped as cults. It was very very strange. And yeah, Rico agrees Mary is a bad example because so Jane, if you just have or Sue, it's like goddess Sue.
Mm-hmm. But within the
god
pantheon,
Bob.
Yeah. If you wouldn't have like
Bob.
If you wouldn't have like Bob and Will and Stacy.
Yes.
And Carol as like your pantheon.
John, the god of toilets.
Oh no. Then you want to keep that in mind too. And then I also want to go back to I think one of the things
Karen, the goddess of complaints.
Yes. I want to go back to another thing that Rohit said earlier, which was the Tiffany problem, which is that like when people hear the name Tiffany, they tend to associate it with, younger people, it being a more modern name. But the name Tiffany was around
in ancient Greece.
Yeah, it's been around for an extremely long time. So
or Melissa, is also like fairly modern sounding, but is just literally like B in Greek.
Yeah. So that also gets to like sort of what time period do your names sound like? Because sometimes what people are looking for is they don't want the game to feel modern. So, because they want to keep sort of this medieval fantasy feel to it. And so what they'll then do is they'll say, okay, I don't want to pick any names that are like names that I would expect my coworkers or relatives to have. I want to pick names that like feel like they're from an older time period.
Yes.
Or that,
And sometimes people just take names and they mix them up. When you're in your native language, it's easy to do that, where you mix it up and make a name that's not exactly anybody's name. Like, instead of Bob, the boring magic god that nobody cares about and is uninteresting, you could have Bokob, the boring magic god that nobody cares about and is uninteresting. And that would be the actual Greyhawk deity of magic. So the problem is when you're moving into a language that you don't really know much about, it can get tricky. And there are multiple schools of thought on that issue that you can have. For example, there's some who believe that you just have to kind of make up fantasy gobbledygook that roughly sounds similar to a source language instead of literally using that source language. And maybe pick names that aren't equivalent of Bob, because otherwise you're just literally taking that language. And there are others that say that that's sort of erasure of that language, and also that if you're not an expert, you're going to do it badly. Whereas if you actually use the language and choose an uncommon name, then it's going to fit better. I have the second school of thought. There are people on both sides, like kind of everywhere. Even in Paizo, that was a big discussion point where.
And I think both sides of that particular perspective are coming from a what is going to be more respectful to the source language? Is it like, and what is going to feel more natural? So like I don't think that there's like an
neither side of that is ill-intended. Neither is like, haha, let's do something terrible for the language. Both legitimately, and I've had conversations with people with the other point of view, are thinking that side is the one that's more respectful of the source material and the source language. And it swung back and forth at Paizo. At Paizo, the pendulum swung at one point towards the gobbledygook version, that it was not supposed to mimic the languages, even though before it had been more on the other side. And then back again, mostly due to the fact that people who were at Paizo, who were from other cultures, saying like, no, we don't actually really like this solution where it's like that for other cultures, but is different for Western cultures. We would rather see it being more similar and more using the language. Yeah. So it's tricky and it's interesting, and there's no one answer.
And
even
then when
though
you have someone who
I may have accidentally presented it as if Like, just because it was the one that Paizo moved back to, it's the one I approve of, that is the right answer. But I don't think it is. I think that either answer could be the right one for you
also
and your group.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that it swung back is that you also had a higher amount of expertise to make those decisions. Like, if you have someone who can then come in and say, I can make something that sounds like it would be a name, like it could be a name and a reasonable name in this language, but then
swung away from that when we also had the expertise that we could have done that. Yeah. So it actually wasn't what you would think, right? Like, we had more people who probably could have made the gobbly names that sort of sounded like they were in the language
but might maybe take, like, some roots.
We had people who could make the expertise, or who had the expertise and could have done that, but it also swung back to not doing that anyway. At the same time. So, it wasn't actually a skill-based rationale. It was just purely a function of who had which opinions and who joined and who left the company. And that's how close it is, and that's how much it is something that really has multiple sides, all of whom had valid points.
Yeah, so then as you're doing a GM, you can, as you're being a GM, then you can think about, like, sort of what approach do you want to take. And one of the tools that I like to use is a website, behindthename.com, which lets you say, okay, I want to generate random names, and I want to do it based on a particular thing. So I want to generate English names, French names, German names, Arabic names, African names. You can generate names from a variety of. Can
you generate Klingon names?
And then you have, like, different categories, right? So you can be like, oh yeah, I want to generate names that are like Swahili from Swahili.
Can we get one from Ghana?
Well, no, it's based on a language.
Oh, okay.
Of origin generally. So you can go through and say, okay, yeah, I want names from this particular language, and then you can randomly generate some names there, and then you can decide, okay, yeah, I want to, I'm going to use, then you can say either I'm using this so that I can use these real names as a baseline, or I'm using this so I can have a list of names and have a little bit more of a sense of, like, what names might sound like, and then use them.
There are a lot of languages on this.
Yes.
So yeah, you could definitely use this to learn about languages. Also, it doesn't let me scroll because I think that
it got stuck in loading.
Oh, it got stuck in loading.
Yep.
There you go. I thought it was locked to your fingerprint. I was like, that's slick.
No, it's not. It's not.
There you go. So Rohit has put that up there as well.
Yeah, and you can check, like, what languages you want. So if you're like, yeah, I have a culture that I have that, like, mixes some aspects of these two cultures, and so I want to, like, take names from.
It looks like it has mythology, ancient.
There's mythology names. It also has, like,
Transformers.
Historical names, Arthurian names, biblical names, like fantasy names from different fantasy things. Like, you can be like, I want fairy names or whatever.
How did you get to your one that had even more languages than this behind the name /red?
There's multiple ways you can search on this.
Well, there you go. This has definitely got a lot of names.
It has a lot of things.
So if I put here that I want
I think it's the same number, but, like, I think it's just presented differently.
If I put here that I want Yoruba and if I put multiple things, is it going to give me, like, a combination?
It'll give you a combination.
Okay, so I want Yoruba and Celtic mythology.
And then you should say.
I would say that
you can say whether you want masculine, feminine, ambiguous, or either.
I want first, middle.
Do you want first?
I want a first name and 3 middle names, and a surname is.
You can do a random surname. They don't do as well on surnames.
Okay, so let's generate this name. It's Yoruba and Celtic. All right, the name is since it actually looks like it's almost entirely Celtic, and so therefore it's very difficult to pronounce because I don't know how to do the vowels. But it looks like it's like Dorian, Murna, Bavin, Rhiannon, Aphelion.
Hit regenerate.
But it's like all Celtic. This one has one that looks Yoruban, Ayomide, which. It's like Ayomide, actually. Yeah. Ayomide, Blodued, Abidemi, Ayo, Abiodun. So I think that Blodued is the main one there that is Welsh.
If you wanted to,
and most of them were Yoruban. So there you go. As you can see, it generated some names. So there are other name generators you can use if you want as well.
And Rohit mentions like Bible names or whatever, biblical names is one of the categories here that you can go with.
That's true. There are definitely sections of the Bible that just have a lot of names. And one thing I sometimes do is use names that are from a particular source to be from a particular place. Like a certain section of one country that has like biblical names.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would kind of will fit together because they're all biblical names, more or less.
Yeah.
And then if you have someone who is there, and like I had an area that had mostly biblical names, and then there was someone whose name was Isabella, and she was not from that section originally, and her name was not from that section, and you could tell based on her name
that she probably had a different background than the people who
and she was an adventurer. She was a sailor who had come from another country.
Mm-hmm.
So exactly.
And then like that also can help you show like how much immigration does your world have, because a world where like societies are very isolated is likely to have more uniform naming traditions, whereas a world where immigration is more common and you're going to have more of a blending of cultures is going to have both recent immigrants and people whose names reflect their ancestry in different ways.
Yep.
So.
And it looks like chat is talking about the French name Guy,
mm-hmm.
which is pronounced usually Guy in English, like Guy Fawkes. But is Guy in French. So there are a lot of things that can be pronounced a different way in different languages, and sometimes English just goes back to French to be pretentious.
Yes.
For example, the word valet, which was pronounced valet in English and valet in French,
mm-hmm.
but people were like valet. That sounds so much more like
fancy
than a valet. No one wants to be a valet. Let's just use valet. And now everybody uses valet pretty much, even though that was just kind of not how it was pronounced before.
Yeah.
And so that's just the kind of thing that just sometimes happens in languages. For names and for words.
Mm-hmm.
So think about how you're pronouncing the names in of your characters as well, if you want. Or you know what, you don't have to do that. You don't have to have a section of your country that's all from the Bible. You can just pick names that are kind of from wherever you want.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on your group's social contract, how much you care about linguistics and naming, but you still want to make sure that you avoid names that are going to cause problems at the table, and that
mm-hmm.
you try to pick names that'll be like interesting or immersive, hopefully memorable. Another thing that you want to think about is whether you want to follow or subvert the fantasy trope of there can only be one person named John in the entire world.
Yeah.
So I have definitely, because I don't like that from a perspective of why is there only one person named John in the entire world. Had situations where I had countries where like the name of their founding queen is also the most common girl's name. And mm-hmm. there are like 15 different shortenings and nickname versions of it that people use, but they all actually mm-hmm. like 30% of women wind up with the name that's named after their founding queen.
Yeah. And so, you might you might decide, okay, well, you want it to make it easier for players to tell them apart, maybe the 4 that they encounter happen to use different nicknames, or one of them like sometimes goes by her middle name because everybody knows because everybody has that name or whatever. But then like it's still like, yeah, that's their name. Or,
and if you try to say like, well, no, because back in in mythology and legends they always have a different name. That's not even true. That's not true at all. The real contest is, and I can't remember which one won in the end of this contest.
Is it Elaine versus something else?
It's Elaine versus Merope. So which are there more of? Elaines in Arthurian legend that are distinctive Elaines who are different Elaines, or Meropes in Greek mythology who are definitely different Meropes who are not mm-hmm. the same Merope as the other Merope. And I don't remember which one is more. We can see if people in chat have a guess as to who wins in Elaines versus Meropes. But the number of Elaines and Meropes is high for both Elaines and for Meropes. And that is something that you can get, especially in Legends and Myths, because of the fact that Legends and Myths and those kind of stories are, just as Jason Tondro said in the episode that we had interviewing him and in his thesis, kind of the comic books of the ancient world, where new writers would just come in and make another story and add more characters. And was it the same name as another character? Maybe it was. And did they just make a new character who was cooler and edgier than the last character? They sometimes did.
And they thought, oh yeah, you know, that's a cool name. I want that name in my story, but I want them to be like a different.
That's right. And since Elaine is the French version of like Helen of Troy, it was just like a common name, I guess, that they were using for these legendary women. And Merope, I don't know why it was popular in Greek mythology. They just like to do it. So let's see which is more, like Merope disambiguation page, or Merope Greek myth, or Elaine. So we're figuring it out once and for all. Wikipedia says that there are 8 different Greek Meropes. There may be more that are not on Wikipedia.
Wikipedia, the definitive source.
Yes, well, it's at least going to give us a source. Arthurian, let's see, Elaine legend. So Elaine from, we have Elaine of Astolat, Elaine of Benoit, Elaine of Corbinac, Elaine of Garlot, and Elaine the Peerless.
And then it says others.
As well as Princess Elaine, daughter of Queen Nantra and Queen Elaine, because her mom's also Elaine. Princess Elaine, daughter of King Pellinor. Princess Elaine, daughter of King Brandigor, and then Elaine, the alternate name of Vivienne, Lady of the Lake, which some people think is the same as Arthur's sister Elaine, who is one of the other Elaines. So if you don't identify that last one together, there are 9 Elaines and 8 Meropes. If you do, there are 8 Elaines and 8 Meropes, and they tied.
So it's very close.
That's right.
They're talking about, Elf is talking about, like, you know, a lot early 1000s names, and a lot of it being people that, you know, around them. So it's like, you know, Pierre, Jacques, Judith, Miles, like modern names. Yeah, historical names. A lot of them are still around, and they feel more modern.
That's right.
People, and then Kidder says, like, you know, people expect names that are hard to pronounce and not use to be like a fantasy name, because they feel different. They feel like this isn't someone that you would just meet walking around.
Right. Or like Alf talked about Jeanne d'Arc, where you might just know someone named Joan or Jeanne. Like walking around, you could meet someone named Joan, but it is also the name of a famous historical figure.
Enrico's talking about hating when a character has like 4 or 5 different names depending on the context, or when a bunch of really similar looking or sounding names are used for a bunch of different important characters. Yeah, so like there is a reason why like only one Steve or whatever it was became like the trope of like, because it is harder for players to keep things straight if like already when people are trying to remember like who are the important characters, it's a lot easier to get confused when the names are similar. So you'll want to make sure that you're using other techniques, and then hopefully like if you're going to have, you know, if you're going to have 3 different Elaines in your story, or like, you know, some Elaines and some Elenas, like you wouldn't put like Elaine and Elena are both important people on like the royal council, because then it's going to be like, oh, it's hard to keep Elaine and Elena apart. But if like Elaine is an important person on the royal council, and like Elena is the tavern keeper over here, and then like there's another Elaine who's like an adventurer that you travel with, then they have like different contexts behind them. It's like you're not going to confuse the counselor and the tavern keeper and the warrior.
Or if your founding queen was named Elaine or Elena, let's say, because you were doing an homage to how many there are in Arthurian legend, then you could have characters like Elle, Ellie, Lena, Laney, Lane, and a bunch of different nicknames like Lana, where you just like cut it in different ways, and they all sound similar, so Rico probably still wouldn't like it.
Or maybe one of them is like, you know, Lady Elaine, and you never drop the lady because of her position or whatever.
Or like in the for Arthurian, like Elaine of Corbinac versus Elaine of Astolat.
So they're also like we were just talking about when the author switches between referring to them by the first and last name by paragraph. That gets to another thing is like with a lot of RPG characters, you're probably not really gonna need a last name for them. Like if they're only gonna be ever referred to by their first name, and you know their like familial connections aren't like super important to the story, like you probably don't need to bother coming up with last names.
If they're like a noble and you call them King Noble last name or like Duke Noble last name, then that might be important.
Yeah. So in that case, maybe
like,
you don't need a first name.
It's
because
Duke Gloucester because he's the Duke of Gloucester.
Yeah. So maybe you don't need a first name then because the PCs aren't going to have a social position to address them.
His
by
first
the first
name is Bob. Duke Bob Gloucester.
There you go. So yeah, you don't have to, and like you probably don't actually need middle names for like, you know, unless you have a society that addresses people that way. And of course, to get to also something that Roa was saying before, you know, when I'm talking about like first names and middle names and last names or whatever, this is a very like English centered way of describing it. You know, maybe you would decide like, okay, you know, and people are generally referred to by surnames, so then you're going to use the surname.
Also,
here.
you might wind up having to switch back and forth in a way that Rico doesn't like if you're in a culture where you normally use the surname unless it's someone that you're close to who you can call by their first name, in which case you have to call them by their surname, except some people call them by their first name because they're closer to that person.
Yeah, so you need, like, basically... just as in the same way as, like, you know, don't need to spend the time detailing out, like, all the shops on the street in the random town that the PCs stop into, you probably don't need the names that you're not expecting the PCs to use as a term of reference or other NPCs to use as a term of reference for the while on screen for the NPC.
So, like, Duke Gloucester, no, you can call me Bob. So Rohit has another question, which is something I wanted to transition to at some point as well, which is, naming is not just something we do for people, or we mention deities who are kind of like people that live in the sky or somewhere else like that. But you also kind of have to name a bunch of other stuff. You have to name countries, geographical locations, cities, continents, worlds, monsters, like not like the name of Bob the Basilisk, but the name of Basilisk.
Yeah.
And there's so many things you have to name, and anything that we talked about, like you can't go on what that name generator site that Linda had to name like your like what is the name of a petrifying lizard, and then you click on Celtic mythology and it's gonna give you like a person's name. It's not gonna give you, I mean, technically we did find Bloodwed in there, which is the name of a fae, because Bloodwed was from the Mabinogion and was created out of flowers by Gwydion so that Lulu Gaffs could have a wife, even though he got a curse from Aryan Road that, like, basically he could not marry a mortal woman. So Gwydion made a woman out of flowers who was not, like, did not count as the same.
There's another generator, fantasynamegenerators.com that I sometimes use.
Can that generate, like, mountains and creatures?
It can generate, like, place names and stuff like that, too. And then you can riff off of that, but you're not really going to get, like, creature names or, like, the name of a river or whatever.
So you also want to think when you're, I mean, it actually just depends. You could just name places whatever you want, and you could just be like, this place is named Jarbaloth, and the other place next to it is named Clyon.
And the place next to that is named Twinwood.
And then Twinwood. Jarbaloth, Clyon, and Twinwood. Or you could be like, let's think about how these different places are being named and trying to tie them up together. For example, in one of the places that I had that had mostly biblical names, there's like one city that's named Yonder, another one that's named Yonasta, and it actually is, you know, the Y-O-N at the beginning is Yon, is like Yonah, which comes from Jonah, who is like a biblical figure who was swallowed by the Leviathan in the Bible, and is a reference to the fact that before that they worshiped like sort of the more, the church that they worship now, that area was ruled by the goddess of water, or like that they had a worship for the goddess of water, and since Jonah was swallowed by the Leviathan, it's a reference to that. So they have place names, several of them that start with Yon in them. And so that was just sort of a thing that I randomly decided to do.
And then the capital there is named after the deity that they currently worship,
which is in the central region, whereas this is in the northeast, because it used to be a separate kingdom that worshipped the water goddess, but was conquered by the kingdom that worships like the primary human deity of the sun. And then there's also another country that is a complete theocracy for that deity of the sun that also is named after her. And so they wind up with the capital of this kingdom that sounds somewhat similar to the name of the theocracy. So if you do that, you can create a sense of continuity. You don't have to, though. You could just name Twinwood and Kion and whatever I said for the other one.
Yeah. So you can come up sort of like a sense of what you want the place names to sound like. Whether you want that to be, derived from a certain language. You could go down a similar route of inspiration and look at like, what do place names in a certain country sound like? Because I have things that are like inspired by cultures from around that particular area. Or you might say, I'm going to have like, in a campaign that I'm doing now, I tend to have like in that particular area, people tend to name villages in ways that are tied to what it is that like geographical features or what they produce, which is, a historical way that villages were sometimes named. And it may be like that I'm literally calling them something that has that, or it might be that I'm taking something that is from that. So like the mining village of Furl came from like Fe for iron because they mine iron there, and I'm not going to spend like a ton of time naming a place that the PCs are going to be in for one session, whereas like if there's going to be like a city where they're going to be based in, I'm going to pay more attention to that because it's going to be around for a while.
Sometimes naming a region or area can do double duty for naming at least one of the NPCs, because it may be named for the person who founded it, like their family name, or the person who goes there has to be named after the region. It can go either direction. So, like, if there's a region that's called, like, the Twinwood region, and then it's like, well, this has always been on the frontier, but it hasn't really had someone there. We actually, like, just expanded into a area that was not claimed by any country to found the Twinwood region. But now we want to make it officially in the border of the kingdom, so I'm assigning a Marquis. Because you would assign a Marquis for a border region. So you, adventure, you are now Marquis Twinwood. You now have the noble lineal name of Twinwood, and you rule over the Twinwood region. And so it could go in that direction, which would be the opposite of, like, saying, okay, you, adventurer, we want to claim this region that nobody's claiming, that nobody's in, and your last name is Smith. So if you do reclaim it and get up to a certain standard, we will make you the Marquis of the Smith Marquisate, and that is what we will do. So it can go in either direction that way, and then you only have to name one thing instead of two things. That's much better. So that can make it a little easier on you, but it's not going to work for everything, and you probably won't want to do that for monsters, even though in the real world, a lot of people do name, like, animals that they're the first one to find after, like, themselves or something like that, where it's like,
the scientific names of animals especially.
Like, yeah, for sure. Like, just, like, the species name. Can be like the person who first discovered them, even if like another part of it is a description of them. Like, for example, the former Maryland state fossil that was never found in Maryland and was erroneously labeled as the Maryland state. It was the state fossil even though you couldn't find it there. Ixphora quadricostata Say. Quadricostata was about the fact that it had 4 ridges, but Say was like, I think, just the dude who found that fossil, not in Maryland. You sometimes just have people who are naming things after themselves, even if it's a creature. But I feel like if you just had a lizard that turned you to stone, and it's like, oh no, it's a Linda lizard or something like that, people would be like, what? It's like, why are all these Lindas going around turning everybody into stone?
Yeah, you probably don't want to use the same sense for like for like creatures. For creatures, I tend to think more of like, what is the feel of certain sounds? You know, if something is what kinds of sounds feel like it? So like, is it like a large and tough creature? Then I'm probably going to be picking, you know, like more rounded sounds, or like, is it like something that's sharp? I'm probably gonna pick like more harsh consonants and think with things like that. What was it like? Booba or Bobo and Kiki, or like, what was that thing? The experiment that was like, what is the shape based on what it sounds like?
Oh yeah, I don't remember exactly, but yes, there was an experiment where people tried to like make sounds and try to figure out what the shape of the thing would be, and just certain sounds have connotations for certain shapes.
Yeah, so it's like it was like, you know, which one of the which one of
you
these
can use that
like
to either meet
Boba, and which one of these is Kiki,
to either meet or subvert expectations.
Yeah, and then they show people like two shapes, and one was rounded and one was spiky, and like everybody said Kiki is the spiky one and Boba is the round one, because like it's just how that sound feels.
Yep.
So you can do the reverse to make things that
you can
sound...
make something that subverts the expectations or that matches them. Either of them works.
Like, you wouldn't want, like, you expect, like, when you hear Kiki, you expect like spiky and like quick, and like probably not like you're not necessarily going to be like, oh yes, it's the legendary Kiki that has terrorized the land for generations. It's the most powerful monster or whatever. Yeah.
What if it's a monkey?
It could be, yeah. But yeah, that's probably gonna be like, you know, maybe it's like an avian monster, maybe it's like a fast moving dinosaur, or maybe it's like an insect or something like that.
What about Boba? Could it be like a bounty hunter?
Yes. Well, okay. Other than that, like maybe it is something it's something that's sort of like large and plotting. Maybe it's like it could be like a creature that is associated with, like, maybe it's a large sea monster, or maybe that's like, I would expect it to be like more rounded in some way, or maybe it's like an earth monster.
Maybe it has like a round helmet.
It could. If you're going to continue to reference Boba Fett, yes, it could.
It could. I mean, it's Boba.
There you go.
So there you go,
But yeah, that's one thing that I do, is like just play around with sounds that have a certain feeling. And see like whether that just pick some syllables that come together. Do other folks have strategies they like to use for naming creature types?
For me, I like to look at mythological references as a possibility for creature types. I also tend to think about the possibility of people naming creatures with just like a descriptive name of what it is. So like, if you have some kind of weird ram monster, it could be named Ares, like the Zodiac ram, but it could also be named just like Twin Horn Ram.
Yeah.
Or something like that. It just depends on what you think people would have named it, and based on the like personalities of the people in a particular region in your world. And it could be that those are both names for the same monster, and that just like there's some pretentious name that most people don't use, and they just use the colloquial name. It's like, yeah, you know, we mostly just call that the giant cat that kills people.
Yeah. Or like you know, in the same setting that has like the things named after other things, there's a type of monster that...
Don't most settings have things named after other things?
No, sorry. The one you were just talking about, where I lost my train of thought, but the one you were just talking about with like the old religion with the things that were named after Yondair and things like that. There was a monster that people just knew as Murder Bear, because like, if you're an adventurer and you're not like in the woods nearby, like if you're low level, if a murder bear appears, you're going to be in serious trouble, because they're not usually in the low level adventuring areas, but like when they do, that's probably how you're most likely to die. So it's Murder Bear.
Yes.
So like,
it's technically is is not actually called a murder
I know
bear.
it's not actually called a murder bear, but that's what everyone calls it.
But people call it that because it kills low-level adventurers.
Yes.
Yep. So you can have colloquial names for different things, and you have to decide, like, who is naming things? Are different people naming things different ways? And Rico would say that he doesn't like it if there's multiple names for things, but it can be more realistic if there might be multiple names for the same things. Or you could make sure you have separate creatures that all have different names, or separate creatures that have different names in the real world. Where in English you definitely wouldn't name the same creature things multiple different ways. For example, you could think about all of the different big cats that are totally not the same creature, like cougars, pumas, mountain lions, catamounts, and panthers. There's so many different members of Panthera genus that are all not the same exact one, except they are.
Yeah,
so,
except they are. Yeah.
There's just a lot of versatility and variety you can use in naming, and it can tell you a lot about the culture based on how they choose to name.
But I would say then, like, if you are using different names for the same thing, you would want it to like have a significance that you're doing it. Like, is that then telling you something about, like, you know, a cultural difference about the way that people refer to this particular thing, in an RPG, right? So that people don't have to like relearn for no benefit. Another thing that this made me think of too is that is creature families is often a thing that you'll have as a way to shorthand and make things easier in like in Pathfinder. So it's like, oh yeah, you know, you have your bear, but you also have your dire bear, or like you have like this thing that is, you know, you have like or you have things that are connected in some way, so they'll have like some similarity in their name.
That's right. And KHF points out that there's a lot of places that, and Rico said as well, that repeat in real world, and like in America, they moved 3 times and were next to a road named Avalon every time, and they are not connecting roads. I'm not surprised. It was convenient for me because I was running an urban fantasy game where one of the characters was like the incarnation of Arthur, and there's an ability that you can use where you just kind of spend a bunch of the MP equivalent and then throw your chances to fate and ask for it to do something. One of the things you can do if you're a master of like the movement and teleportation abilities like he was, is ask to like get me out of here.
Yeah.
And he combined that with also having like a sixth sense, so when something very dangerous was about to hit, he would always get
I'm
premonition.
in serious trouble. Get me out of here.
So he would always use it, so like a bomb would go off right next to him and he would escape.
Yeah.
And I constantly made him, this is Linda's character before she figured out that it was a reincarnation of Arthur. He always emerged from like the water near Avalon. But there are a lot of Avalons.
So yeah, it was like, you know, sometimes it was on like an island, and sometimes it was like sometimes it was like in like Las Vegas in the casino, and like...
And yeah, they say Spidey sense activate teleportation in the chat. Well, he did need to he always kept enough
of those points in reserve, like,
of his points, so that he could use that if something bad happened.
Yeah, like
so
that was the thing he did. So
his
he
pool was essentially smaller because
Yes.
he wanted to always make sure
he
could
really
do it.
freaked out when he had to spend those other points. He's like, oh my gosh, I don't have enough to unleash Wayfarer. I'm in serious trouble.
That's right. And so it was mostly in LA, and so there's like an island that also has an Avalon polity on it, on like Catalina Island, which is pretty close by. So that one wasn't as bad for him as some of the other Avalons, but there are a lot of Avalons.
Yeah, well, he definitely wound up in the UK and was like, well, I gotta find my way back. I can't exactly... Well, one of the things...
Also, at one point, Sicily, in one of the spots that people think might be... They weren't always just something named Avalon. People think that maybe the spot in Sicily that is near that one inland lake that's like red, which was supposedly the site where Persephone was abducted by Hades, might also be Avalon, and there's a few other islands that people.
Oh,
have
that's
thought
one
that
you
might be
hadn't done.
Avalon.
Water near random Toyota Avalons, like a Toyota dealership where it's like, here's where, or like
Yeah.
a factory that's making Toyota Avalons, and it's like, what the heck is this one this time?
Yeah, I hadn't done that one.
That
but
one's
there's,
hilarious.
There's enough other Avalons that I didn't need to worry about
Yeah,
that.
but you could do that sometimes.
And then the name Avalon just like has this very mystical seeming thing, but it just means like island of apples.
Yeah.
It's just like that's what the name is. So a lot of names when you come down to it are more descriptive than you think when you go back to the data like original source language. And that is why when I was saying you could just kind of name something a descriptive name, you kind of can.
Given the way the character is, if the car was anywhere near working shape, he would definitely acquire the car temporarily and use it to get to another place. Maybe get to an airport, magically sneak in and to stuff himself in the cargo hold of a plane that was heading in the right direction and then come out again.
That's probably true.
Yep.
That's probably true. I mean, he's had to.
How many planes has he caught like in the cargo hold at this point? Like a lot.
2 or 3
Yeah.
at least.
Like whatever part they store pets in, like he goes there.
Mm-hmm. Just sneak on board and go to the next destination.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think we talked a lot about names, and we covered a lot of what I wanted to cover. I'm gonna paste this poll in the chat, and shall we say goodbye to YouTube?
Yes, let's.
All right. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.